Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about the representation of gender in popular culture. Okay, so this goes along with general topic of gender inequality, right? So that we're in this section of the class where we're talking about inequality, how some groups of people in a society have more resources, more power than other groups. And we've seen that with economic inequality, we've seen it with health inequalities, we've seen it with gender economic inequality. In today's lesson, the goal is to look at how there is an inequality in how the genders are represented in popular culture. And so essentially what we're going to be seeing is how women are represented in a way that men are not represented in movies, TV shows, comic books, advertisements. And that there is a certain degree of inequality to that. In general, what we might be able to say is that, what we've seen in the last, I would say, 30 to 40 years is women improving their economic position in society, right? That there is more, I would say, more economic equality between the genders, right? Not complete equality, but just, more of it. But that there is still, to a certain degree, a large degree, inequality in terms of how men and women are represented in our culture. So as a little bit of a warning, some of the images that are going to be showing up on the screen and that you'll see in the PowerPoint slide, and you'll see in the video, some of the video links that are in the PowerPoint slide, could be offensive or upsetting to some people. They're, typical images and videos that you'll see, in popular culture. Music videos, a clip from movies like Star Trek. And so it's nothing exceptional. It's what we consume in our everyday lives. But once you start realizing what you're being presented with, it can be upsetting. So we're going to be talking about the representation of gender in popular culture. And unfortunately, for this lesson, I really prefer this lesson to be in class. In class allows us to talk about, the sociological investigation and to talk about your own examinations of gender in the media that you watch for this investigation. And so it works much better, I think, when it's in class. So it's unfortunate. And it means that the video lesson might be a little bit shorter today. It also means we get to talk more about, men and women. The lecture itself, the lesson is a bit more focused on the representation of women in popular culture. But in the discussion, we can talk about both men and women. And so it kind of, that's a difference as well. So we can't do that, obviously. So, these were some of the things we were going to talk about. Gender norms, how are women and men represented, how do you think it's changed over time, things like that. But we can't do that. So instead, the lesson today is really going to be talking about the representation of women. And we're going to talk about this in two ways. One is this really a measure of screen time, right? So how much are women represented in popular culture? And so this is done through what's called the Bechdel Test, which comes from an artist, actually, Bechdel, who created this test. And talk about that. And then beyond how much or how often women are represented, we can talk about how women are represented. So not just how often, but how they're represented in popular culture. Okay, so the Bechdel test, right? So this is really a test of how often or how much screen time do women get, right? And so it's a pretty basic test. It's a test that was designed by Alison Bechdel, the artist. And basically to pass this test, to pass the Bechdel test, you just have to satisfy some really basic criteria. One, you have to have 2 or more female characters that have names, right? So you have to have female characters in your movie, and these female characters, movie or show, and these female characters have to have names. They can't just be, an extra or somebody walking down the street who's a woman. They have to be real characters who we care about. The women have to talk to one another, right? So it's not just women talking to men or men talking to men. It has to be women talking to women. And then lastly, do the women talk to each other about something else that's not about a man, right? So do they talk about a subject that has nothing to do with men, right? And so really, the Bechdel test is in some sense a measurement of how often women are represented in the media, and it has nothing to do with men, right? It's just about women. So we can imagine that this seems like a pretty basic requirement, this test. It seems pretty simple. And that what we might imagine is that it would be very easy to pass, like that nearly every movie would pass this test or should pass it. And, that's kind of an argument. And so what we find actually is, while it's true that most movies and shows pass this test, what we find is that there's still about a third of shows that fail this test, right? They fail the Bechdel test, right? So we can see that when we look at the representation of movies over time, right? So this graph here is just about movies. We see that it has increased over time, right? So in 1930s, 1940s, only about half the movies fully passed the test. But there's been a slow increase over time. But still that there's a certain number of movies in which they don't pass. And there's actually some famous examples of them, right? So here we have the original Star Wars movie, right? It has a strong female character, a female character, Princess Leia, but it fails the test because the female characters never talk to one another in the original trilogy, right? The original trilogy from the 1970s, 80s, right? And so the female characters, never talk to one another, right? They're always talking to a man, right? So you have men talking to each other, or you have Luke talking to Han, but you never have Leia talking to another female character. Social Network fails, right? So this is a movie that was famous maybe, about 10, 15 years ago about Facebook. It has no, doesn't have female characters. Avengers, this is a good example actually of what we find to be typical or normal, right? So we have the Avengers, one of the first really famous comic book movies. And so what we find is, right, this movie of comic book characters has a lot of male characters, right? You got the Hulk, you got Thor, you got Captain America, Iron Man, Hawkeye, right? And they're all talking to one another, right? They're all got names. But you really have very sparsely, not very many female characters, right? So there's only one female member of the Avengers, right? That in the original Avengers, right, movie. And none of the female characters actually talk to one another, right? So later on, there are other female characters other than Black Widow, like Hill in the Shield, but they never talk to one another, right? So again, it's the reason why most of the movies fail is not because they don't have female characters that have names, but that the female characters never talk to one another. They're never interacting one-on-one. They're always typically talking to a man. Okay, here's another good example. This is The End. It's a really actually very funny movie, right? A movie with a whole bunch of male characters facing the apocalypse, but there's basically essentially no female characters, right? There's one female character. There's a few female characters that show up at the start, but that's not really the movie. But then during the whole movie, it's really about these guys, and then there's one female character that shows up in the middle of the movie, Emma Watson. Lord of the Rings, right? The trilogy, all fail, right? Basically because of lack of female characters, right? And the female characters who don't talk to one another, right? Harry Potter, right? Fails. Not all the Harry Potters, but this one. Oh, Thor, right? Thor. So even a pretty contemporary one, right? Again, a contemporary movie with strong female characters, right? The main villain protagonist is a female, and one of the main side characters is also female, but they never interact, right? And so again, it is failing because a female character is not interacting with one another. Game of Thrones, 74% of the episodes fail, right? And so what we see here is that this is really a measure of how often women are represented in popular culture. And this is this goes along with other things. The idea that when there's a measure of like talking time, how much talking time characters get, male characters get about twice as much talking time as female characters. So the first kind of measure of inequality in terms of gender is that female characters aren't really represented as much in the media as male characters, right? Male characters are still kind of the central figure. This is changing, and we can see it changing. And what's interesting is now there are a number of movies that do pass it, right? So Black Panther is a good one. You actually have a number of female characters who are actually together, right? Interacting with one another. And you actually have now you actually start to beginning to have a series of movies in which it's a really strong female cast. A movie like Annihilation, there's actually hardly any male protagonists or characters, right? The main cast is all female, right? Hereditary is another good example of this. Right? And we actually even see a situation in which now they're again like Annihilation. They are movies being created in which the main cast is female. But again, I guess what I would wonder is actually, is this advancement? Is it advancement in some sense, kind of remaking old movies and then just making the cast all female, right? So what happened with Ghostbusters, what happened with Ocean's 8. Is that is that a better is that progress, or is that just kind of boxing women into their own movies, their own kind of version of an action movie or something like that? And again, we could, if we were in class, we could talk about this. Okay, so we've talked about how often women are represented. Now we really want to talk about how women are represented, right? So not how much, not a measure of screen time, but rather how are women depicted. And again, what we can say is, a lot of this is a description of how women have been presented in the late 20th century, like so the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and then into the 21st century, right? And so we can wonder, a good discussion is, if it was in class, is to talk about, are these things changing? How much are some of the things I'm saying still relevant or still current, or has there been progress? Okay, so let's jump in. So what's a concept in which we can understand the representation of women? So one key concept is what's called the male gaze, right? Though this is kind of a very old concept, and it's kind of quite a famous one, and I think it personally still holds water. It still has usefulness to it. So what is this concept? Basically, the idea of this concept is that a piece of popular culture is being created, like a movie or a TV show or a computer game. It's imagined that the person who is watching that show or consuming that form of media is a man, right? That the media, the TV, the movie is created as if a man is watching it, right? So that when a TV show is created, right? When a show is written, when a movie is written, the people, the creators, think about who's watching it, who's going to be sitting in front of the screen, who's the watcher, right? Who's observing. An idea is, well, this is imagined to be a man, right? This is what's called the male gaze. That when we look at a TV show, when we look at a movie, we're watching that movie as if through the eyes of a man, right? That the man is behind the screen, or watching the screen. Right? And so another way to understand this is that what happens then, if the man is the viewer, if the man is the one watching or observing, well, then what are they watching? What becomes the object, right? Well, then it becomes a woman, right? So in some sense, it's kind of a dual concept, right? It becomes the man as the viewer, the watcher, and then the woman as the object, the thing to be watched, right? And so this sets up a kind of a contrast or a certain degree of inequality. To be an observer is in some sense to have power, right? To be able to have action, right? You're doing something. Whereas to be an object, to be the thing observed, is to be passive, right? You're just sitting there, you're just being watched, right? And so it sets up a kind of a inequality in the sense that the observer as a man has more control and has more activity, whereas the woman as an object is more passive and has less power, right? And we can kind of see this in terms of, in stories as well, right? The idea of, kind of fairy tales like the damsel in distress, the woman waiting around in a tower waiting to be rescued, and the man comes and rescues, right? And again, the idea that the man as active, whereas the woman as passive. Now, importantly, there two things happen here, which is kind of summed up nicely in this quote. Right? So this quote by John Berger, who talked about this, and he talked about this in terms of art, but I think it's also what he's saying is relevant to popular culture, and he thinks it's relevant to popular culture, right? So what he says is that to simplify this idea of the male gaze, men act and women appear, right? Observing is a action, whereas being observed is just an appearance, right? Men look at women, and women watch themselves being looked at. And the important thing here is that this idea of the male gaze, the man as the watcher, the observer, and the woman as a thing being observed, this sets up the relationship between men and women, right? Men and women, men see themselves as the person being watched, and women see themselves being watched, right, as the object. But importantly, what he also says, John Berger and other people have said, is that it also affects how women view themselves, right? That the woman begins to understand that she is watching herself, right? That she sees herself as an object, right? She sees herself being watched, right? She observes herself being observed, right? So how to understand this? This concept is a little bit abstract, and so can we, in some sense, kind of see it in action? And so one way to see it in action is to look at advertisements. And so what we're going to do is show you a series of advertisements or images. And I'm going to show you this with, through a lot of today is going to be showing you ads. These are, poster ads, so visual ads, right? And so again, what we're seeing here is, the idea of a male gaze, right? So here is the first one, right? It's a pretty common advertisement. It's an advertisement for a cell phone. But it sums up this idea pretty well, right? What we see here is, the man taking a photo with his amazing cell phone. And so what we see here is the man as the observer, the man as the photographer, and the woman as the object, right? The woman as the thing being photographed, right? And so this is a pretty good example of the male gaze, right? What we can imagine. And the idea here is that these advertisements, it's rarely the other way around. It's really rarely, not never, but rarely you'll see it as the woman as the observer and the man being the object being observed, right? And often then, if this is, the woman being watched, observed, it's observed in a sexualized way, right? And you kind of see here again, kind of another advertisement. You see women being observed, in a sexualized manner, right? And this advertisement actually becomes a little bit worse when you see what's happening in the background. All right, so what we see is the man taking a picture of two women. So the man, the person, you're supposed to be a viewer and you're supposed to be a man, right, watching these women who are scantily clad. But what's worse, actually, even than that, when you realize it, is that there's other men in the background, right? Man behind the curtain, men in the windows who are also watching, kind of this idea of the peeping Tom kind of thing, right? And so again, but it sets up this whole idea, right, that the man as observer, and then how do men watch women? They watch them as objects. They watch them as sexualized objects, for their appearance. Right. And so again, what we see here then is another example of this, right? Again, this one for cigarettes. And so a little bit, the ads is a little bit older because you rarely see ads for cigarettes nowadays. But right, you have this man and he's the observer, right? We're taking the position of the man holding this pack of cigarettes. And what is he looking at? He's looking at a woman. But he also shows us what? The woman's looking at the man in the mirror. She's seeing herself being watched, right? She's looking behind herself and seeing the man looking at her, right? That's the idea of the male gaze, right? That the woman sees herself being observed, right? So it's not just men looking at women, but women observing that they're being observed by men, right? So that's a key part, right? Women watching themselves being watched, right? That sets up how women experience their own representation in the media, right? That they understand that they will be scrutinized, right? That their appearance, their looks will be looked at, will be observed and judged by men, right? And so there's a good actually example of this in terms of movie posters. And so it's actually interesting that in movie posters, you see, and also kind of magazines, you see the same image of women being represented again and again. It's actually kind of very stereotypical, and it's very much has become a trope, right? And so what is that image? It's an image of a woman from behind, right? So looking at her back, right? So again, it's sexualized because the idea is that the viewer is a man and he is looking over her body and judging her and kind of presumably gaining some satisfaction from looking at her body. But then also what's happening in this image is that the woman is looking back at the camera, seeing herself being watched, right? Seeing herself being observed. Right? So we see this in this magazine poster here. We see it again in the Avengers, right? So a woman's body from legs to head, being observed and watched, and then she almost looking from behind, looking back at the camera. Right, again, we see it again, a poster for G.I. Joe, right? Woman from behind being looked at by a male viewer, theoretically, and then the character looking back, right? Thor, right? The Dark World, right? So again, we have the same idea, right? The woman looking back at the camera, watching herself being observed. An idea here is you never really see this at all for male characters or male posters. You never see a man being photographed, his whole body, and then him looking back at the camera. Like that's not usually a trope. That's not a thing because the man is not the object. Man is the observer doing the watching, right? Again, actually when you start seeing this, you can see it over and over and over again, right? So it's very stereotypical. It really has become a cliche, right? So Spectre, James Bond movie, a woman being photographed from behind, an idea of a male viewer watching her, and she's looking back at the camera, watching herself being watched. Right? Again, this sets up the relationship of how women see themselves. Right? Tomb Raider, same thing. Right? So kind of evidence is probably pretty obvious by now. Right? Tron Legacy, same thing. Woman being photographed from behind, looking back, seeing herself being observed. Right? The man is the viewer, the woman is the object to be viewed. The man is active, the woman is passive. Right? Even a show, contemporary show like this Chilling Adventures of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, this show on Netflix. All right, so a pretty contemporary show, strong female characters, passes the Bechdel test, because there's a lot of female characters with names who talk to each other. But even this one, right? It's even in a contemporary 21st century show, you have a female character being looked at from behind, watching herself being observed and looking back at the camera. Now her body's not fully exposed because she's sitting in a chair, but the same idea, right? Star Wars, again, strong female character, right? The main character in the movie, but the posters cannot resist putting that female character in the same pose. Woman being looked at from behind, from the idea of a male viewer seeing herself being watched, looking back at the camera. Right? Even in advertisements in which it's trying to be body positive, right? So we see new Dove soap. This is the idea of like body positive advertising, which I'm a bit cynical about. But okay, but it's the idea that women should be positive about the appearance and different body types, etc., etc. But even when this type of idea is adopted that is supposed to be pro women and more accepting, you see the same stereotypical trope, right? Women being observed, women being watched, right? A woman being watched presumably by a man and looking back at the camera being looked at, seeing herself being observed, right? And what I found is this cliche is so stereotypical, is so cliched now that movies like Deadpool even make fun of it, right? And so you have Deadpool, who's this kind of comic book character who is kind of it's an R-rated movie, and it's a little bit more risque, but he's making fun of this stereotypical thing. And the joke here is that this is a man, right? And this never happens with men, right? We never see a male character or a male comic book character being photographed in this way. That's the joke, right? That you would never see Thor or Iron Man or Captain America being photographed from behind and then looking back at the camera. But we see it all the time with female characters. Okay? And the idea here is that this is actually nothing new, right? Women have been being watched, women have been being observed and being turned into objects for probably 1,000 or more years, right? That we see this in art, right? Right. So the nude, the female nude, is a classic kind of representation of a form of art, right? To paint naked women, right, and to have their bodies appear in nude, and for the enjoyment, for the pleasure of the viewer, and presumably the male viewer, right? And so here it's a woman laying on a bed as an object, right, as a thing, just like the dog on the bed, or just like the other objects in the room. The woman is also an object. She's passive. She's just lying there. She's not doing anything. The only thing that she is doing is being observed, is being looked at and watched, right? And so again, the same idea. This is interesting. You look at this, compare this to one of the first advertisements we looked at with the women on the bed being photographed by that camera, right? It's actually interesting. It's this very similar idea right here. Here you have a woman on a bed being looked at, right? Being observed. It seems like she's startled or somewhat surprised that she's being looked at. And there's even a guy behind a curtain looking at her, right? And so, it's actually interesting to compare these old art forms to more popular advertisements, right? So compare this to the image we looked at before of the two scantily clad women on the bed, right? Again, here we have this classic stereotypical cliche again, right? The woman being drawn, right, being observed, being painted from behind, and then looking back at the painter, right? So just like in those movie posters, looking back and watching herself being observed, right? And so the idea here is that these modern forms of how women are represented in popular culture are actually nothing new, but it has been something that has been going on for a long, long time. Women appearing as objects, right? To be drawn, to be photographed, to be looked at, to be observed, right? And so they are passive, they are objects, right? They are objectified. And who then is objectifying them? Who then is watching them? It is men, right? So it becomes women as the object and men as the observer. So if men are the observer and women are the object, how are they depicted? So now I'm going to tell you nothing surprising at all, something quite obvious. Women are depicted in a sexualized manner, right? So often, women are just, their bodies, their appearance is depicted in a way that is pleasing in terms of their looks, right? Right, in a sexualized manner. And we see this all the time. I don't think I'm telling you anything shocking or surprising, right? It's quite normal to us, right? So to have women, half naked women appearing on magazines, both magazines for theoretically for men, like so Sports Illustrated, the swimsuit edition, but also magazines for women, Cosmopolitan, right? What we see in both these magazines is women being depicted on the cover, being depicted in a sexualized manner. And what's interesting in some sense is that this is so normal for us that we just take this for granted, right? That the sexualization of women's bodies is something that we don't even question or think about. It just happens, and we accept it as normal, right? That is part of, in some sense, the problem, right? I like to kind of a good example of this, not just magazines, but in movies. So hopefully I can share a clip right now. Hopefully this works. Okay, so I'm going to share a clip from a very typical movie. Neither an amazing movie nor a bad movie, just a normal, average Hollywood movie. This is Star Trek, right? The new Star Trek. So the scene starts with some male characters, obviously, right, talking to one another, right? And then the plot is progressing. There's some problem that the characters have to solve, so the plot is progressing, and then we see a female character come in. So let me play the clip.
The weapons specialist. Perhaps she could be of some use. What admiral's daughter? Carol Marcus. Your new science officer concealed her identity to board the ship. When were you going to tell me that? When it became relevant, as it just did.
Are the torpedoes in the weapons bay?
Loaded and ready to fire. What are they?
I don't know. That's why I forged my transfer onto your ship, to find out why. I do apologize for that. By the way, if I caused you any problems, I am sorry. I'm Carol Marcus.
Ginger Curve.
Torpedoes. My father gave me access to every program he oversaw, and when I heard he was developing these prototype torpedoes, and when I went to confront him about it, he wouldn't even see me. That's when I discovered the torpedoes had disappeared from all official records.
And then he gave them to me.
Much cleverer than your reputation suggests, Captain Kirk.
I have a reputation.
Yes, you do. I'm a friend of Christine Chappell's.
Christine, yes. How is she?
She transferred to the outer frontier to be a nurse. She's much happier now.
That's good.
You have no idea who I'm talking about, do you?
What are we doing in here?
Is this shuttle prepped to fly?
Of course it is.
Would you please turn around?
Why?
Just turn around. It's too dangerous to try and open one of these torpedoes on the Enterprise, but there is a nearby planetoid. I can open one up there, but I will need some help. Turn around. Now.
So this is a good example of many things, actually. So what is an example is, firstly, it's example of the sexualization of women. So right, you have a female actress, and for some reason in the middle of the movie, she is just disrobed, and we look at her, half naked body. It has nothing to do with the plot. It doesn't progress the plot at all. It's not about character development. It has nothing to do with the story. It's just simply in the movie to have a scantily clad woman in the movie, right? But it's also, so it's about the sexualization of women and how that's just so normal, in terms of modern movies and modern representation of women, right? That this is just nothing we even think about. It just is, we accept it as normal, even though it's not actually that normal. But it's also an example of the male gaze, right? That, he's the main character, right? And he's, looking at the woman, right? And she's watching herself being looked at, right? And so, it's kind of an example of all of these things. So as I said, oops, okay, hopefully this works. So as I said, that this is something we accept as normal. And I think the best example of the normality of it, what we think of as normal, is in music videos. So in music videos, all the time you see the sexualization of women, right? Women put into positions and places where just their bodies are looked at, and objectified, right? And again, we just accept this again as normal, right? And this is not anything new. This has been happening for ages, ever since Britney Spears or even before, right? Again, I have this clip in the thing. It's kind of a clip of kind of these music videos. And so what's interesting is to play this clip. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long. To play this clip with no music, right? You just play it dead silent, and you really get a different experience than if you actually hear the music. Right. What's interesting is that what you get then is this concept of what's called sometimes headless women. Right. So if women are sexualized, what it means then is you don't need the whole woman. Right. You just need body parts. Right. And so what you have is you just have certain body parts of women being sexualized. Right. So you get the sexual parts of women's bodies, their rear ends, their legs, right? So again, the idea here is you're not getting a whole woman. You're just getting a leg or a foot, right? Or lips or a belly button, right? You're just getting parts of a woman because all you're really caring about is her body as an object, or parts of her body as an object. You don't even need the whole woman. You just need the parts of her body to look at. Right. And so again, this has been going on for ages. So it's in contemporary movies like Jennifer's Body, so lips, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? The movie, legs, right? And it's weirdly, it happens in all sorts of places actually. Right? So it happens in adult movies like The Kingsman, but it also happens in cartoon movies, right? Like Minions, right? You get this poster for Minions in which the woman has no head, literally, right? Fry, right? So this is documentary. Even happens with documentaries, right? Bachelor Party, which is the old Tom Hanks movie, Legs. But even a thing like Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman, this new movie, contemporary movie, is supposed to be, a positive woman as a role model, strong, right? But even in the poster for that, what we get is a shoulder and lips, right? And so the idea here is, why is this happening? It's really you're getting a woman not as a full person, right? Not as a real person who has thoughts and ideas and hopes and dreams and can do things, is a live living person, right? You're just getting parts of their body. You're getting literally an object, a leg, lips, right? And so it's really turning women into an object, and sometimes dehumanizing them, right? Not even treating them as a full person, cutting off their heads. Okay, so we've seen this. We see that the sexualization of women, but it's actually, I would say that the inequality in terms of women is not just sexualized, but it's actually an issue of subordination. That when women are depicted, they're depicted in a way that signifies or symbolizes that they are less powerful than men. Right? It is supposed to represent their lower position in society. So what I'm going to do is show you some obvious examples of this from in the earlier of the 20th century. So this kind of goes along with your investigation. Like look at the contemporary times and look at older 20th century, then look at contemporary times, see if things have changed. So I'm going to show examples of this from the earlier 20th century, and then some contemporary examples, and we can see what things have changed or what things have not changed. Right? So we see this from I think what it is. It's like from the 1950s. Right, so an obvious ritual subordination of women. Right, so you got 4 women carrying this one guy in this incredibly ugly T-shirt that they're trying to sell. Right, but the man is superior, and the woman there has to carry them around. That's kind of blatant. Right, we see it here. Right, a woman kneeling, giving her husband, I guess, a breakfast and bread, breakfast and bed. And show her to man's world. Right? So we can be more obvious than that, right? But again, we see it here. Women all around this guy, but for some reason, the woman can't stand up, right? So she's kneeling. She's lower than the man, right? I mean, this often actually happens a lot, right? Women are depicted as physically lower than men, right? As kneeling, their heads are lower, and it is there's also some subtle sexualization going on here, maybe not so subtle, but it's also showing or appearing that the woman is not as powerful, right? Right. So again, here's a contemporary example of this. Right, the woman as being sexualized, obviously, but also not just sexualized. It's also this idea of being physically lower than the man, right? Showing her lower position, not just in the ad, but in society. Right. And so again, this is depicted not just in when the woman is sexualized, but just in kind of everyday ads. Right. So here we have an ad for Pepsi Cola. Nothing really sexualized about it. But again, the man is at the top of the ad, right? And the woman is kneeling, right, lower than. Right? And we see this in contemporary ads, right? The man looking down at the woman, right? Again, there's some kind of subtle stories or hidden stories about gender that are going on here. Again, the man at the top of the ad, the woman at the bottom. Right? Once you start to see this, you actually see it a lot. It's not as often, or it's pretty rare actually to see the woman at the top and the man at the bottom. Right? Again, right, woman not being able to stand up, right? So woman at the bottom, gripping on the man's shoes, and the man at the top. Interestingly, here the man is headless. I don't know what that means so much. Again, right, same story. Woman at the bottom, also sexualized, or appearing scantily clad, but so are the male characters. But again, more importantly, it is that the woman is put at a lower position, right, physically in the ad, suggesting her lower position in society. Right? And so the idea is the position of people in the ad is symbolizing something. It's not just an accident. It's being done on purpose. If it just happened once or twice, we would be like, oh, that doesn't mean anything. But if you keep seeing the same thing over and over and over again, it seems to tend to symbolize something. Okay? The last thing to talk about then is something not as common, but probably more common than maybe it should be, which is this idea of the play assault. So the play assault is this idea that the depiction in popular culture in which the man is doing something physically aggressive to a woman, but it's kind of being done in a joking way, supposedly, right? And so there is a kind of a story going on here that Goffman, the person who kind of did this idea, it says, everybody who sees it kind of makes sense, right? It's violence as a depiction of power, right? That if you're allowed to be violent, if one person is allowed to be violent to another person, it's showing that the person is powerful. But it's also, it's an example of how that power will be enforced, through physical violence. So this is not obviously happen all the time, but it happens sometimes. Right? So we see older examples of this, right? So you see, an ad here for coffee from the 1960s, and so we see here the wife, presumably being spanked by the man because she didn't buy the right type of coffee, right? And so again, this is kind of a joke, or kind of like there's kind of a joke going on here, supposedly. But it is a hint at physical violence. The man will be physically aggressive to the woman if she doesn't do the right thing, right? And what's weird, actually, is that you see spanking happening a lot in earlier popular culture. In like the 1950s, 60s, men were spanking women a lot, right? So we see Superman spanking a woman. We see Batman spanking a woman. And that this was just kind of thought of as normal, right? There's another thing to understand here is it's not just about spanking, is right. So who spanks who? Typically, it's a parent spanking a child, typically in the 1950s and 60s, right? So if a woman is being spanked, it's actually also an example of infantilization, right? Turning the woman into a child. And children obviously have less power. But it's not just spanking. Often what we see is sometimes more serious forms of this violence being depicted. Again, this doesn't happen all the time. This is more on an extreme end, where right, what you see is, you know, an ad like this where a scantily clad woman is being grabbed by multiple men, right? Or a man grabbing a woman from behind. Right? So what you see is a lot of times men grabbing women, right? Even in kind of advertisements, this is an ad for a TV show called Rain, I think, about Middle Ages, right? What we have is a man grabbing a woman from behind, putting his hand on her throat. It's a quite, you know, pretty serious depiction of force, right? A woman being on a dartboard type thing and having knives thrown at her, right? So kind of violence in a more subtle way, right? A man grabbing or strangling a woman with a tie. Sometimes they get ridiculous, right? Here, it happens even if there's not a man in the ad. And so you have a scantily clad woman whose eyes are kind of closed, but what you then see is this kind of menacing figure standing above her. Right? You just see the shadow, right? But there is this kind of story happening here, this depiction of what's going to happen next, right? And some simple things like this, you know, a man grabbing a woman's sweater, right? Because the woman won't share, I guess, the hair product, right? And then again, in other countries, right, from France, we have a woman being grabbed from behind, his hand around her throat. And this again is what is weird about this is that it normalizes it, right? That we see images like this and we don't think anything of it, just like the music videos where women are depicted in a certain way, right? Again, woman being grabbed from behind, right? Here's a kind of a good example of this in kind of contemporary times. So this is an image of the actress Salma Hayek. So what we see here is Salma Hayek being grabbed by her arm, being put into an elevator with three men, and one of the men has a bottle of alcohol, right? And so the question then we can ask is, what's going to happen next, right? What's the next scene in this story, right? And so, you know, it hints at violence or hints at something worrisome, right? Particularly the look on Salma Hayek's face, right? Sometimes it gets more obvious, right? And some of these ads have really been kind of criticized, critiqued for this being, you know, pretty shocking and pretty, you know, terrible, right? So a woman being grabbed and held down, right? Woman being grabbed by her hair and held down, right? And so what we see here, you know, this ad from Australia actually, you know, you see here, you know, these ads have really been criticized as for kind of going over a line, but you know, while these ones are not subtle and they're more extreme, you know, we see examples of the use of physical force in many other ads. So really, you know, what we see is that what I would argue is that while women's position economically has gotten better, increased in the last 3 or 4 years, there's still a certain degree to which the representation of women in popular culture leaves much to be asked for, right? That the women are not represented, I would say, in a way that you know, speaks of equality. That's it for today.